I worked on Water Street in New York City. As usual, I started my morning with a cup of coffee and a raisin bagel I bought on my way to work. I still felt a bit sleepy and lazy, but I knew that breakfast would wake me up, and in a few minutes, I would be ready to start my workday. My desk phone rang, and the caller ID showed my husband Derek's work number. He always called me in the morning to make sure I got to work safely. We both commuted to our jobs on express buses. I went to Lower Manhattan, and he went to Weehawken, New Jersey. The building he worked in was on the opposite side of the Hudson River from Manhattan. Derek always admired the view of Manhattan through the panoramic window of his building. "Hi, honey. How are you?" I greeted my husband. But instead of his usual morning prelude, "I just want to tell you that I love you," he exclaimed, "Do you know that the World Trade Center is on fire?" "What?" "The World Trade Center is on fire," he repeated. "How is it on fire?" I couldn't understand. How can anyone understand something that seems absurd, impossible? A plane flew into the North Tower, somewhere on the 70th floor, creating a huge hole. The entire top part of the building is in flames and smoke. I can see it through our window. It's horrifying. What's happening there? You can't imagine. It's terrible. Knowing my husband's tendency to exaggerate, I replied, "Let me talk to people and find out what they know. I'll call you back later." And I hung up. The two towers of the World Trade Center were only a few blocks from my building, so if this had really happened, people would be talking about it. After speaking with me, Derek hung up and returned to the window. The North Tower was burning like a giant devilish torch. "What a nightmare," he muttered. "Oh. The boss is coming," his colleague whispered. "What's going on here?" the boss asked irritably. Everyone silently stared at him in confusion. "Derek, what are you doing here?" "My wife is there," my husband replied, feeling a burning sensation in his chest and a desire to punch his boss in the face. "Where is there?" the boss demanded. "On Water Street." "That's too far. Nothing will happen to her. Get back to work. The show is over. Enough. Get back to your desks." Derek returned to his desk. But he couldn't work. "She needs to get out of Manhattan," Derek thought. "But what if her boss is as much of a jerk as mine and won't let her go? She's obedient. I have to tell her to leave right now." Derek decided and dialed my phone number. "Please. Honey. Pick up the phone," he pleaded. But there was no answer. Meanwhile, I was walking down the corridor and hearing confirmation of what my husband had just told me. People were in shock, but I felt detached, as if it were happening not to me and not here but somewhere in a distant world. Boom! Suddenly, I was shaken by the sound of an explosion that resonated inside me. It seemed like the sky exploded. I was seized by nervous tremors, and a chill ran down my spine. Recovering from the fright, Derek ran back to the window, trembling all over. A crowd of employees was already standing, watching the horrifying scene across the Hudson River. Now both towers were blazing like two devilish torches, and a huge black cloud of smoke spread even thicker over the city, engulfing people, cars, parks, and buildings. The second plane crashed into the South Tower. The second plane. The second plane. The second plane echoed throughout the floor. People in shock were recounting what they had seen with their own eyes. The hole in the South Tower was too low. Derek, a former civil engineer, instantly assessed the situation. "This tower won't stand for long," he thought. "It will collapse soon enough. God! How many people have died there? And how many more will die? What to do? How can I save her? What is this? War? What if another plane crashes into her building? God! Where is she? What's happening to her? He headed toward his desk. Passing by one of the offices, he saw a woman sobbing. Her colleagues were trying to comfort her, but she was hysterical. From their conversation, he understood that her husband worked on the 70th floor of the South Tower. And it was obvious that if he hadn't died yet, he would soon. Derek's heart pounded with fear. In my building, the siren wailed, and an immediate order was given to evacuate. I quickly returned to my desk and called my husband, but he didn't answer. I didn't have time to wait for him as people were rapidly leaving the building, so I ran after my colleagues, planning to call him from my mobile as soon as I got outside. Derek suddenly heard his phone ringing. He rushed to his desk but missed it. He was met with an empty dial tone. He dialed my number again. After a few rings, the answering machine picked up, and he left a message. I'm begging you. Leave the building as soon as possible. And try to go home. If you can, call me. Please leave there. He didn't know what else to say. He hung up. But it didn't comfort him. He needed to hear my voice. He dialed my mobile number, but there was no connection. Derek stood by his desk, staring at the phone, desperately wanting to do something but not knowing what. He would have gone to New York. But how? The car was at home in the garage. The only available transport was the express bus that ran only in the morning and evening, and only in the direction home. There was no connection with Manhattan. He would be able to get home only in the evening. How much time would pass since the catastrophe? Anything could happen. There were many questions, but not a single answer. Only helplessness and fear. By habit, I headed for the elevator but changed my mind on the way. Who knows what might happen to the elevator in such a situation? So, I headed for the stairs. A line had formed at the door leading to the stairs, and it became clear that the descent would be long and exhausting because people from the 10 lower floors were ahead of us. Suddenly, I saw my colleague Anna, with whom I often spent breaks. We slowly descended the stairs, chatting as we went. I can't even imagine how long it will take for the people in the Twin Towers to get down, Anna said. Yeah, if they even manage to evacuate. Judging by what people are saying, it's a real catastrophe over there. I can't even picture it. It just doesn't make sense, I replied. We stepped into a typical September morning in New York, with bright sunlight reflecting off the mirrored skyscrapers, a promising sign of a hot day. Groups of people gathered here and there, talking, trying to make sense of what was happening. I tried to call my husband, but there was no signal. Everyone around me was trying to reach their loved ones, but it was clear that no one was getting through. A man standing nearby, seeing the worry on my face, explained, a plane crashed into the North Tower on the upper floors. That tower has an antenna that provides communication for the whole city. Of course, it's damaged. People stood or wandered in front of the building, waiting for any news from the authorities. There was no shade or benches to escape the blazing sun and sit for a minute. The heat was getting worse. The men took off their jackets and unbuttoned their shirts. Unfortunately, neither Ina nor I could take off our long-sleeved dresses, so there was no relief. Ina, let's go to McDonald's, I suggested. There's a phone and a restroom. We could use a break from the heat. Besides, I need to call my husband, he's probably going out of his mind with worry not knowing where I am and what's happening. Ina happily agreed, as she also wanted to call her family. We went to the McDonald's a block away. It was packed with people who had formed a line to the payphone. While standing in line, I noticed an 18-year-old girl sitting at one of the tables. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Her lips and hands were trembling. Someone was trying to comfort her, and from their conversation, I learned that she worked on the 3rd floor of the North Tower. She was one of the lucky few who managed to escape the burning building, but it was clear that she would be in shock for a long time. Her fear started to transfer to me. Our turn at the phone was approaching. The man in front of us in line was talking to his family. "Terrorists have bombed the Pentagon," he announced after finishing his call and hanging up the phone. "Oh my God!" Ines screamed. "The war has started." She was in a panic. My reaction was completely different. Unable to believe or comprehend what was happening, I denied everything I heard. "That's nonsense," I said firmly, trying to calm her down. "Listen to me. Don't listen to anyone. There is no war. War is a deeply personal word for us, people from Russia. We grew up in the shadow of war, and our lives were defined by the idea that life could be tough, but as long as there was no war, everything was okay. If there was no food in the store, we were grateful there was no war. If the water stopped running in the kitchen sink or the central heater broke down in the house and no one could fix it during the harsh winter, we were grateful there was no war. If the local pharmacy didn't have the necessary medicines, we were grateful there was no war. We watched war movies, played war games, and studied books about war. Even our little children in kindergarten were taught that proper nutrition and washing their feet in cold water would help them become real soldiers. In schools, kindergartens, and at work, adults and children were brought up to be ready to fight in a war that could break out at any moment. However, when my family and I left that country, the word war was no longer part of our lives. We live in America, and there is no war here. In recent years, I had felt so safe and secure, and I would not allow the ghost of war to haunt me again. "Ina, no matter what he says, don't listen to him. Someone has made up stories, and you're panicking. Why the Pentagon? Why not the Vatican or the White House? Stop freaking out." I refused to believe and tried to calm Ina, but it was difficult. "Did you not hear what he just said? They are saying it on TV," she cried. Our turn at the phone finally came, and Ina dialed her home number. Her mother's crying voice came through the receiver. "I'm okay, Mom." Ina cried into the phone. "It's terrible. My God. What will happen to us?" Nothing could stop her tears at that moment. The line was buzzing, not letting anyone talk for long. Ina hung up the phone. She confirmed everything, "Lou. Both towers are on fire. A third plane hit the Pentagon. They're talking about it on all the TV channels. This is war." I didn't know what to say or how to comfort her. I dialed my husband's mobile number, but there was no signal. I also called him at his work number, but he didn't answer. After several attempts, I handed the phone to the next person in line. We left McDonald's and walked back to our building. "I hope they let us go home," I said, trying to sound optimistic. "I don't know how much longer I can stand under this blazing sun." My son attended high school in Marlboro, New Jersey. At that moment, he was sitting in his first history class, not even trying to focus. How could he concentrate on this lesson? He thought. Boring. And the teacher is such an idiot. Of course, I promised my mom I'd try to concentrate, but it's impossible. The only thing I care about in this class is her. He occasionally glanced at the girl sitting in another row, 3 desks ahead of him. So beautiful. How can I talk to her? She's always with her friends. He couldn't take his eyes off her. Sometimes she would turn her head, seemingly casually, and glance at him too. But he always looked away in embarrassment. He clearly lacked the courage to ask her out. Suddenly, the fire alarm went off. An announcement came from the principal. But my son didn't react and didn't hear what was just announced. Only when he saw the fear on her face did he realize he had missed something important. The World Trade Center is on fire. All of Lower Manhattan is being evacuated, someone shouted. He panicked. Mom. What about my mom? Classes were cancelled. Students were in a panic, not knowing what to do. Some cried. Those with cell phones called their parents. Everyone was trying to find a way to get home. My son didn't have a cell phone, so he borrowed one from a classmate and called me, then his father, but our cell phones weren't working. He was in a panic. One of his classmates' parents drove him home. He entered the empty house, sat on the couch, turned on the TV, and saw what had shocked the entire world. Mom! He cried in despair. At that time, my husband was sitting at his desk, and the inactivity was killing him. Someone shouted, "One of the buildings has collapsed." He ran back to the window to see the shocking reality. As he had suspected, the South Tower was gone. In its place rose a huge, heavy black cloud of smoke and dust, spreading over the city like a monster, seemingly devouring one building after another, leaving only darkness and destruction in its wake. Only the North Tower remained, burning like a deadly torch against the clear blue sky. Colleagues watched in silence through the window, some crying. He remained silent, though his heart was weeping. He thought about his life with me, his best friend, the only love of his life, and the mother of his children. My smile, my scent, my words flashed through his mind, causing unbearable pain in his heart. "Where are you? What's happening to you?" he thought, swallowing tears that didn't flow from his eyes but poured into his soul. The boss walked by several times, but he no longer cared. Ina and I were walking slowly toward our building. We were crossing Broadway when suddenly a man ran past us, his face distorted with fear, screaming in horror, "One of the towers has collapsed." I turned around and felt a chilling cold spread through my body despite the blazing sun. An enormous, heavy gray cloud of smoke and dust was flying toward us at incredible speed. It seemed like a tsunami, advancing on us like a monstrous creature, engulfing skyscrapers one by one. Ina and I stood frozen in shock, unable to move, watching this horror movie come to life. People, gripped by panic, ran from the terrifying cloud, turning into a chaotic crowd. I was the first to snap out of the shock and looked around. Seeing a crowd heading toward the pier, I pulled Ina away from the crowd. In my youth, I once found myself in the middle of a chaotic crowd and had avoided large gatherings ever since. It was 25 years ago in Kharkiv, Ukraine, when I was 18. Like any young girl, I wanted to attend concerts by popular musicians. It was rare for anyone to come to our city for a concert, and tickets were usually impossible to get. One day, a popular rock band came to town to perform in the city park. The park was surrounded by a beautiful metal fence. I arrived at the park entrance more than an hour before the concert and got in line for tickets. There were only 5 or 6 people in front of me, and I was sure I would get a ticket. But over time, the number of people around me increased. The people in line pressed closer together to prevent anyone from cutting in, which happened often. 2 burly guys stood behind me, pressing me harder and harder until I and those in front of me were on the other side of the ticket booth. However, the ticket window never opened. Before I realized what was happening, the crowd pushed me out of line, and I knew I wouldn't get a ticket. Not getting a ticket was just bad luck. I didn't understand the danger I was in. I started pushing through the crowd, trying to get out. The people were packed too tightly. It took immense effort to squeeze between them. Suddenly, the concert began. The familiar voices of the celebrities filled the air, and the crowd, drawn by the sounds of a popular song, pushed me toward the park entrance. The police blocked the entrance and were forcefully pushing people back. At the same time, those at the back of the crowd were pushing harder, hoping to break through the gates and get into the concert. I was stuck in the middle. The crowd swayed me back and forth, my feet barely touching the ground. It was hard to breathe, and I was losing strength. Stepping on something, I realized someone was lying on the ground, being trampled by the crowd. Stop pushing. Someone's on the ground. I shouted, but my voice was too weak and drowned in the crowd's noise. I felt like the crowd was about to crush me. I was in a vice, being squeezed tighter and tighter, just a little more, and my chest would break. I was losing strength and stopped resisting. They were still pushing me, and my mind was drifting away. For some strange reason, the crowd suddenly stopped pushing, and I felt relief and took a breath. Dizziness still clouded my vision, but I desperately started pushing through the crowd again and finally broke free from its grip. I found all the buttons on my dress ripped off. I had to hold my dress closed all the way home to avoid showing my nakedness. I hurried home, worrying about the lost buttons. Mom will kill me for these buttons. Where will I find replacements? I thought. The next day, the grapevine brought stories of how a man had tragically died, trampled by the crowd, and several others were hospitalized with injuries during the concert in the city park. Since then, I've avoided crowds. The thought of a crowd fills me with horror. I looked around and realized we didn't have time. I grabbed Anna's hand and pulled her along. Come on. Don't look back. Quick. I shouted. We ran down Broadway toward South Street, closer to the water. But we couldn't escape the cloud. It engulfed us. Heavy and suffocating. Moments ago, the sun and bright blue sky were above us, but now the sky had vanished. Thick, sticky dust and acrid smoke clung to our skin, hair, eyelashes, and lips, invaded our noses, and stuck to our mucous membranes, covering my glasses. The heavy metallic smell filled my lungs. Breathing became difficult. I was desperately short of oxygen. I took off my beautiful but synthetic jacket, and with nothing better, I covered my face with it and tried to breathe through the fabric. After wiping my glasses with the jacket, I looked around. Behind us, to the south, was the river. The murky cloud of smoke and dust continued to bring ash and debris from the fire in the north. To the left, the ferry station was packed with people. To the right, the Brooklyn Bridge, partially covered in a gray cloud, extended over the East River. Perhaps we should head to the Brooklyn Bridge. At least we could breathe there, I thought. Let's go to the bridge. I shouted, my voice muffled by the jacket. I quickly moved to the right, dragging Inna with me. She was still in shock. People around us were in a panic, not knowing where to go or what to do. A young woman in her mid-20s ran past, covering her head with her hands, screaming in terror, Lord forgive. Lord forgive. Lord forgive. A young man and a girl, whom he held tightly by the hand, ran past. Don't be afraid, my love. You're with me. We'll get out of here. Trust me, he reassured her. We moved forward, not yet knowing that South Street turns into a highway divided into two parts by a high barrier, one leading north toward downtown Manhattan, the other to the Brooklyn Bridge. Soon we found ourselves on the path leading under the bridge. The barrier was invisible. We weren't alone in our desire to get to the bridge. The further we walked, the denser the crowd became. The flow of people was strong, and panic began to set in, even though no one gave me a reason to fear the crowd. I stepped on something. It was a thick, scribbled notebook. Scattered along the road were various belongings abandoned by people fleeing in panic. I kept stumbling over someone's backpack or glasses, a lone high-heeled shoe, a hairpin, a half-eaten sandwich, or a broken, trampled cell phone. Despite the critical situation, to my surprise, people behaved decently. They moved with respect for themselves and others. Though gripped by terror and running in desperation, no one was elbowing or throwing punches. Even amidst fear and suffocating smoke, they didn't turn into wild beasts ruthlessly trampling everything in their path. Despite my own fear, I felt proud to be among this crowd of civilized people who, even in the face of terror, retained their humanity. This moment made me realize the deep difference between the people in the country where I was born and lived the first 35 years of my life and those I had lived among for the past 12 years. Suddenly, the sound of an airplane engine roared above us. People looked up but saw nothing, as the cloud of smoke and dust obscured the sky. Everyone quickened their pace. I hunched my shoulders in fear and looked up, trying to spot the plane in the thick gray haze, but it was nowhere to be seen, only the loud, terrifying roar of the engine was overhead. I also quickened my pace. Then, I saw a man by the roadside. He wasn't fleeing. He stood with the demeanor of a commander. I don't know what position he held, but I knew he was a true hero and leader. He stood by the road, loudly addressing the people passing by. His words had a calming effect. Who was he? I don't know. I had never seen him on television. His presence was a reminder that among us are brave, capable people who can take the initiative in critical situations, despite their own survival instincts. Please, stay calm, the man was saying. This is a rescue plane. We just need to keep moving. Everything will be fine. People listened, calmed down, and kept walking. I walked past and felt calmer too. For a long time, I could still hear his commanding voice repeating soothing words to the passing crowd. Later, reflecting on the events of that day, I thought about this man, wondering how he could have known it was a rescue plane. No one had any phone service or contact with anyone. He was one of us, and there was no way he could have known what kind of plane it was. He simply understood that people were frightened by the unknown and took it upon himself to prevent panic that could have led to undesirable consequences. His courage and determination were truly remarkable. Finally, we reached a barrier we needed to climb over to get onto the road leading to the Brooklyn Bridge. Ina jumped over the barrier relatively easily, but I couldn't even lift myself high enough to sit on it. More and more people were approaching the barrier, all needing to climb over it. I stood there, utterly helpless. I tried with all my might to lift myself, but I couldn't manage. People started pushing from all sides, and I felt the rising panic. Tears of despair streamed from my eyes. Suddenly, strong hands lifted me like a child, and I found myself on top of the barrier. I was incredibly surprised, as the last time someone picked me up like that was 30 years ago when I was much lighter. I was grateful to this stranger for his help, but I don't remember if I thanked him because the crowd was rushing, and I was overwhelmed with a mix of emotions, gratitude, surprise, embarrassment, and despair over my ruined silk pants, which got damaged when the stranger helped me onto the rough cement surface of the barrier. What can I do? I always remain a woman, even when I need to find my inner strength in critical situations. At last, we stepped onto the Brooklyn Bridge. My feet were already sore from walking about half a mile to the bridge in high heels, and now I had to cross the Brooklyn Bridge, which is more than a mile long, in the same heels. I would have gone barefoot, but the road was littered with small pieces of asphalt and broken glass. There was no other option, so I limped across the bridge, painfully aware of my sneakers lying under my desk at work. Meanwhile, Ina constantly voiced her fears, whining and grumbling about the possibility of World War III and other global catastrophes. I paid little attention to her words, only occasionally commenting, "Come on, hurry up. Everything will be fine." Although I had no idea what would actually be fine, I preferred to face obstacles as they came. I looked at the people walking beside me, strangers I didn't know and might never see again. Yet, deep in my soul, I felt a profound connection, a sense of love and unity with them. We were of different ages, characters, religions, nationalities, incomes, and social standings, but we had one commonality. Among us, there were no white, yellow, brown, or black people. We were all gray, covered in the ash of a catastrophe that discriminated against no one. This was a harsh moment in our lives, but in my soul, it remained a beautiful experience of equality that I would never forget. We were completely covered in dust and ash, hair, eyebrows, eyelashes, faces, and clothes. I constantly had to wipe my glasses to see where I was going. I coughed all the time, and my throat burned from inhaling particles of ash and dust. Some men tore sleeves off their shirts and made improvised face masks out of them. I would have done the same if I had suitable clothing. My jacket and dress were polyester. I took off the jacket and used it as a towel and mask, which helped me a little not to inhale dust and smoke, but breathing through polyester was extremely difficult, especially on such an unbearably hot day. My face, neck, and body were wet with sweat. Sweat mixed with dust and ash, sticking to my forehead and fogging up my glasses. My body itched from sweat and adhering dust and ash. It was hard to move, hard to breathe, hard to see. We were right in the middle of the Brooklyn Bridge when the guy next to me suddenly turned around. His movement prompted me to do the same. I turned and froze at what I saw. Right above my head stood a huge tower blazing like a giant torch. Fire! I involuntarily exclaimed in shock. But it wasn't just a fire, it was a monstrous disaster caused by people. The sight unveiled before my eyes was so horrifyingly mesmerizing that I couldn't look away. In my vocabulary, there was no word that could explain what was happening before me. Once upon a time, I had witnessed a fire, a sight that left an indelible mark in my memory. It was in Russia, in the city of Arkhangelsk. I was on a bus on a small city street. It was late evening, the trip was long, and I had dozed off. Suddenly, the bus stopped, jolting me awake. Passengers were talking about the road being blocked. I finally opened my eyes and saw through the bus window a huge flame. This sight banished any trace of sleepiness from me. A 3-story wooden residential house was completely engulfed in flames. From some windows, parts of furniture protruded. The residents were apparently trying to save their furniture from the fire by throwing it out of the windows, but they didn't manage to do so in time. The high temperature of the fire scorched the nearby trees, giving their branches a whitish hue. Firefighters covered a street lamp with fireproof fabric, trying to protect it from the high temperature. The yellow-red flames licked the black night sky, creating an incredible contrast of colors, as if it were the breath of an invisible dragon, filling the night with magic and danger. If it weren't for the fact that people had lost their homes, this scene would have seemed quite charming to me. A crowd of the building's residents had gathered around the burning structure. They kept a safe distance, hoping the firefighters would quickly extinguish the raging fire. All these people seemed completely alike, like cut-out black matryoshka dolls. They all wore the same black coveralls, felt boots, and gray scarves. Only the children could be distinguished by their size. Such clothing was common in rural Russia, where people worked in labor camps, their only means of livelihood. These means were sufficient only for food and a makeshift bed. Firefighters sprayed water on the house, but they couldn't extinguish the fire. The wooden house was old. The wood had dried out, and the fire consumed it at an incredible speed. The house burned down to the ground. The firefighters were satisfied that the flames did not spread to neighboring buildings. They folded their hoses, removed the fireproof fabric from the street lamp, and left, ringing their bell. The fire victims were left homeless and without assistance. They were left to fend for themselves. Some of the fire victims went to seek shelter in the homes of relatives and friends. Others had nowhere to go and stayed near their burned-down home, homeless, without food, and without hope of assistance. However, some compassionate neighbors from nearby houses brought them a little food, all they could spare. In that country, there were no state organizations helping people in distress. I stood on the Brooklyn Bridge in front of the most catastrophic and devastating fire in history. Could I call this sight charming? No. It was a monstrous spectacle that froze my blood despite the hot day. It was impossible to imagine how devilish one had to be to create such a calamity. No single word could convey the full scale of the tragedy that stood before me. I stood as if rooted to the spot, unable to speak, hear, or feel. I was gripped by horror. My God! There are people there. How many people? Hundreds. This can't be. It felt like I was in a nightmarish dream where there was no strength to shout, escape, or flee. But a nightmare usually woke me up, and this time it didn't end, it was real. The North Tower, with its antenna on top, was engulfed in flames and black smoke rising high into the sky. The second tower was already gone, and I briefly thought it wasn't visible because the smoke from the burning building obscured it. These two buildings had always been more than just a symbol of America to me. They seemed something constant, eternal, something that always was, is, and will be, like some eternal mountain. And despite being told that one building had collapsed and despite the dense smoky haze hanging in the air as evidence of the catastrophe that had occurred, and despite being covered in dust and ash from this collapsed building, I couldn't grasp that it was gone. Long after this sight, the image of this burning tower would haunt me in my dreams, waking me up in the middle of the night. Stunned, I grabbed Anna's hand and dragged her along. "Don't look back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I forced myself not to think about what I had just seen. My gaze was directed ahead, and I tried to calculate how much time I would need to cross this bridge, trying not to pay attention to the pain in my feet and toes. Fortunately, soon the road became clean, without shards of broken glass, and I took off my heels and walked barefoot. At that time, my husband was looking out of the window of the building where he worked and could not believe his eyes. As an engineer, he understood that both buildings were supposed to collapse. But emotionally, he couldn't accept this fact. According to all the rules of structural analysis, the second tower began to collapse. It was more like a vision than reality. As a construction engineer, he had always been very meticulous in his calculations, which he checked and rechecked many times, knowing that many lives depended on his calculations. As the head of his family, he always looked several steps ahead, anticipating potential problems to prevent disasters. For him, it was unbearable to watch what was happening and realize that he couldn't help in any way. The tower crumbled, raising a colossal cloud of dust and smoke. Usually, we use the word disaster to describe something like a volcano erupting or a meteorite explosion. But at that moment, it was something else entirely. It was a new kind of catastrophe, something no one had ever seen before. The towering building fell, burying alive those who hadn't managed to evacuate, destroying nearby buildings, filling the city streets with stench, breaking lives and futures of countless people. And once again, dust and smoke began to spread rapidly throughout Lower Manhattan, reaching the building where I worked. Tears welled up in his eyes, which he couldn't stop. Suddenly, people around us began to run faster. Someone shouted, "The second tower has fallen." I turned around. The burning skyscraper I had seen just minutes ago was already gone. But a colossal gray cloud was approaching us, as if hell itself was chasing us. I could barely comprehend what had happened when the cloud engulfed us, covering us with ash and dust that seeped into our ears, eyes, nose, and mouth, sticking to our bodies, clothes, and hair. Movement was suspended. Everyone around was gasping for air, covering their faces with whatever they could find to filter the air. Ines stood next to me, in a constant state of panic. "This bridge is a perfect target for terrorists. Don't you think?" "Everything will be fine," I repeated once again. But to confirm her words, we heard the loud roar of an airplane right above our heads. Standing in a dirty cloud of ash and dust, we did not see it. But it was enough to hear the sound of the engine to fill the soul with fear. Who knows, if they could fly into skyscrapers, why not destroy the Brooklyn Bridge where so many people were escaping? But the fears proved groundless, and we continued our way. I thought about how quickly I crossed the Brooklyn Bridge by car. In minutes. But how long it seemed when we crossed it on foot, covered in ash and wet caustic dust, under the roar of an unknown airplane over our heads. Nevertheless, I remained myself, and despite the situation, to another comment of Ina, that nothing good is waiting for us, I joked, yes, we'll still laugh, remembering how some man lifted my wide butt and put it so high that it was difficult for me to get off there. And in general, it's romance to walk barefoot on the Brooklyn Bridge. Ina, my joke did not make an impression, but I felt easier to go. Ina was lighter than me and walked faster. I told her to go ahead without me, but she stayed, and soon we arrived on the other side of the East River. As soon as we left the bridge, volunteers from a neighboring church met us, offering us water and wet wipes to wipe our faces from dust and ash. I couldn't help but be amazed at the kindness and care of these people. Where did they come from? And how quickly they oriented themselves. It was really wonderful. The streets of Brooklyn were teeming with people covered in ash and dust. Continuing our journey, I couldn't help but think about the victims of the burning apartment building in Russia who were left to fend for themselves. There were no religious organizations or government social services that could offer any assistance or support. Once again, I thanked fate for living in this wonderful country among these wonderful people. I wanted to buy some shoes that I could walk painlessly in. But all the stores were closed. However, I was lucky. In a small shop, I begged its owner to sell me a few pairs of socks. The soles of my feet were worn almost to blisters, and I realized that if I continued to walk barefoot, I would soon wear them to blood. Putting on several pairs of socks, I felt like I was in paradise. And we headed for the bus that was supposed to take us to Ina's apartment. The bus was overcrowded, but for some reason, it didn't move. We waited half an hour and decided to walk. We would have to walk for several hours, but it was better than waiting indefinitely, unsure if the bus would ever leave. The subway wasn't working either. Near the subway station, we approached a police officer for help, and he gave us a map of Brooklyn, which helped us find our way. We walked without hurrying, conserving our strength for the long journey. Fortunately, an hour later, a minibus picked us up, and 30 minutes later, we were at Ina's home. I called home, and my son answered with a frightened voice, full of despair. "Mom. Are you okay? Mom. Where are you?" And he cried. My poor child. Since he found out what had happened in Manhattan, a lot of time had passed. He tried to call me, but the connection was lost. He was very scared. "I'm fine, my dear. I'll try to come home tomorrow. Right now, all the roads are closed, so I'll stay overnight at my friend's place. I promise I'll be home tomorrow." In his apartment, the TV didn't stop talking about the same thing, horrific terrorist attacks on Manhattan and Washington. Again and again on the screen, a plane crashed into buildings that were an unchanging part of the cityscape. The towers burned, smoked, and fell. Those who were outside the evacuation zone jumped out of burning buildings, preferring to die quickly rather than be burned alive. Pedestrians ran. Ferries were crowded with people. The destruction was catastrophic. Desperately, I didn't want to believe that this wasn't a horror movie but reality. And despite being far from what had happened, the nightmare continued. I called my friend Ines, who lived nearby and worked in a building next to the World Trade Center. This allowed us to often take breaks together, either in the cafeteria, gym, or park. She wasn't home. Her husband told me she was fine and staying with her parents in Queens. I called her, and we agreed to meet at the station the next day to go home together. The night was an endless nightmare. Planes roared overhead, buildings fell, and they kept falling, forming huge black clouds that flew towards the city, destroying everything in their path. I ran in my heels on the hot, soft asphalt of the road. My heels sank into the asphalt like mud, dragging me down as if into a bog. I tried to cry for help, but my mouth and throat were clogged with soot and dirt, and I couldn't make a sound. I tried to open my eyes to see which plane was roaring overhead. But my eyes were tightly sealed shut with grime. I rubbed my eyes and managed to open them, but I couldn't see anything. The lenses of my glasses were opaque. It felt like I was blind. I gasped for air, feeling like there was no more oxygen. And I woke up in cold sweat, only to fall asleep again, running, drowning, and trying to cry for help to save my life. In the morning, Ina told me news she heard on TV. Somewhere near Jersey City, the Muslim community openly celebrated victory over Manhattan. It was hard to believe. Perhaps as hard as yesterday, when I couldn't believe the World Trade Center had been destroyed. I headed to the train station in Manhattan. Walking along 34th Street, I saw a young Muslim woman in her traditional dress. Normally, passing Muslims didn't evoke any emotions in me. Manhattan is known as a melting pot because of its cultural, social, and ethnic diversity. This term illustrates the image of a melting pot where different cultures and nationalities mix and interact, creating a unique, dynamic, and diverse social environment. I was accustomed to the diversity of people. But that day, seeing this young woman openly and frivolously walking through my city, which had been destroyed by her fellow religionists, a wave of hatred engulfed me. How dare she openly take pride in her affiliation with terrorists? How dare she rejoice in the tragedy of the city and all its inhabitants? How could she not be oppressed by the fear that she was one of them and the residents of New York could tear her apart? Most of my life I lived under a communist regime, and there, in that country, she would not have dared to behave like that. But I've lived in America for many years now, and my behavior has been appropriate. So I silently walked past her, though I was boiling with rage. When I saw Ina waiting for me near the station, I finally gave in to my emotions. We hugged each other tightly and didn't let go, allowing ourselves to cry all our tears for yesterday. My husband aged a lot in the last day and night. He held me tightly, still not believing his luck that I was alive. He didn't want and couldn't let me go, afraid that something would happen to me again. God! How much he loves me. It's scary. How much I mean to him. And if, God forbid, I disappeared from his life, the world without me would become unbearable for him. My children. They grew up in just one day and realized that everything they have, they should not take for granted. Access to Manhattan was closed, and only a week later, people were able to return to their jobs, but it seemed like an eternity to me. Manhattan was unrecognizable. Normally bustling streets, full of people and cars, were eerily quiet and deserted. Armed military and police stood on every corner. There was a sharp, poisonous smell in the air. Dust still lay on benches left from September 11th. People returned to work. They walked in silence, only the dull sound of footsteps breaking the silence. Some cautiously looked around, but mostly, with grim faces, they looked ahead or down at their feet. My office moved to Water Street just a few months ago when the company expanded and needed additional space. But the main office remained in the former World Trade Center building on the 86th floor, which had been home to the company and my colleagues for decades. And now all those who worked on the 86th floor perished. Grief and tears filled the office all day long. No one could work, and management did not demand it on the first day, understanding that for employees who had worked in the company for many years, the deceased were not just colleagues but close people with whom they shared their lives. Everyone experienced the loss differently. Some cried loudly, some were silent and withdrawn, some were angry at the whole world, and some tried not to show their weakness, but their faces paled and faded. There wasn't a single person who remained indifferent. How to explain and understand the grief of losing a loved one? How to endure emotional suffering. How to dry tears. How to lift the spirit. And how much time is needed for the wounds of the soul to heal. There are no definite answers to these questions. I was lucky. None of the people I knew died in the World Trade Center. I felt fear, but despite being at the center of the tragedy and seeing it on TV many times, the reality of what happened fully hit me only a few days later. I walked my familiar route to the Cube statue, the place where Ina and I used to meet during breaks. All the trees and street lamps were covered with photos of missing people. Hundreds of eyes looked at me from the photos hanging on every tree and lamp post. There were the eyes of children, filled with happiness and carefreeness. Children who were hugged by their parents, who gave them love and care, catering to their innocent childhood whims. And just a few days ago, this happiness and carefreeness were lost forever. There were the eyes of young women and men with near and distant plans, full of hopes for the future. They were the pride, support, and comfort of their elderly parents. And now the future, support, and comfort turned to dust and ashes. I walked slowly, studying the faces. Tears blurred my vision, streaming down my face in an uninterrupted flow. Breathing was difficult, silent sobbing choked me. What was usually a short journey to the Cube on that day felt like an eternity. I noticed a photograph of a beautiful Indian girl about 25 years old, posted on every streetlight and tree. Her family had placed her photo everywhere in the hope that someone would recognize her. I didn't know this girl, but her face was forever imprinted in my memory. I would recognize her among 1,000 faces, her gentle smile, smooth as pearl, skin, brown eyes with long lashes, long straight black hair. How could one bear her disappearance, so young, beautiful, and surely successful, since she worked in such a prestigious place? What a heavy loss of youth and hope. I passed the Trinity Church on Broadway, one of the most important landmarks in Lower Manhattan since the late 17th century. The church stood undamaged despite the buildings around it being seriously damaged. Its fence, doors, and nearby trees were covered with numerous photos, candles, and flowers. I walked this path countless times. A couple more blocks, and I would be at my favorite meeting place that always greeted me with charm. I usually stood near the Cube sculpture created by Isamu Noguchi, waiting for Ina, and enjoyed the view of the park on the other side of the street against the backdrop of the Twin Towers, as an integral part of the blue sky. Life was always bustling in the park. Hot dogs, fruits, and pretzels were sold here. People played chess, sunbathed, read, and ate, sitting either on the grass or on benches. It was particularly amusing to watch one bench where a sculpture of a young man in a hat sat, reading a newspaper. Often someone would sit down next to him and read the newspaper too. Sometimes during the lunch break, an orchestra would play there. And, of course, many New York squirrels and pigeons considered this park their home. But here I am at our meeting place. Everything I remembered and loved disappeared as if it had never been here. All that remained were ruins and an endless stream of people paying tribute to the victims of the tragedy, leaving cards, flowers, flags, notes on trees, street lamps, fences, walls, and building doors. Seeing this firsthand was much more agonizing than watching it on TV, and I could no longer hold back my tears. I stood there and howled like a wolf, unable to cry out all my tears. They flowed in a salty river down my face, but relief from tears did not come. I walked away with a heavy heart. I continued to work in the same building on Water Street and for several months watched trucks bring the remains of the World Trade Center, which were loaded onto ferries and taken away. We usually get used to something that happens around us all the time, and I thought that soon I would be indifferent to this sight. But I was wrong. Every time a freight ferry left the dock, carrying away the remains of the World Trade Center, it took away a part of my soul.